This podcast is brought to you by the state of North Carolina. If you're looking for a leg up for your business, look no further than North Carolina. There are many reasons that CNBC has ranked it the top state for business. The evolution of its tax code is one of them. Among all states with a corporate tax rate, North Carolina has the lowest. Even better, by 2030, it won't even have one. Now that'll make the neighbors jealous. So if you're all in on better business, it's all in North Carolina. Visit allinnc.com to learn more.
Your window of opportunity is opening, but is your business ready for what's coming? Be good surprises and bad surprises ready. Be new markets, no problems ready. Be paid family leave ready. Be ready with SAP. Visit sap.com/be ready.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 389, interview with Saul David about his book, Devil Dogs, From Guadalcanal to the Shores of Japan, King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Saul David, best-selling military historian, novelist, and broadcaster, writer of such books as Crucible of Hell, Okinawa, The Last Great Battle of the Second World War, The Force, the legendary Special Ops Unit, World War II's Mission Impossible, and at least 13 other books, comes on the show as his latest book follows King Company from Guadalcanal to the shores of Japan. Mr. David, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me on, Ray.
Absolutely. I loved your book. We're going to get into it, but I first have to say I've been doing this for about 10 years now, and I've had more than a few people question my sanity trying to cover such a large topic as World War II. So it's only fair that I get to ask you, what motivated you to write a book about a company and then follow it all the way through the war?
Well, I'd previously written about the story of the final stage of the Pacific campaign, and that is Okinawa. Mm-hmm. The book Crucible of Hell, of course, involved both Army and Marines. But while I was working my way through the horrors of that campaign and really dealing particularly with some of the first-hand accounts which I managed to get hold of at Quantico, where the U.S. Marine Corps has its archives, mm-hmm. I asked myself the question, these guys, this is the final act for these guys, but where did it all start and how did they get here? And are there any of the original survivors left in the story? So that was when I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to tell the whole story of the Pacific War, I need to focus in on quite an intimate group. And therefore, I was, I'm very happy to admit, of course, because why wouldn't you follow such a brilliant example as Band of Brothers to pick a company? And of course, there's something, as you know, Ray, very special about a company. It is the home for, it's the smallest tactical group, I suppose, that soldiers or Marines would call home during the Second World War and possibly, arguably even today. And therefore, it was through the prism, the very intimate prism of the company that I was hoping to tell the story of how it all began and how it ended, of course.
Right. I guess it becomes like your home away from home, your family. And of course, what these guys are about to go through, it's going to, obviously affect them for the rest of their lives. Before we jump into this, I have to ask, where did the term devil dogs come from?
Well, we have to go back to the First World War to understand the derivation. And it is a little bit confusing, I have to say, because the U.S. Marines fought very effectively towards the latter stages of the First World War, of course, particularly the battles of St. Mihiel and various other engagements in 1918, Belleau Wood, of course, being probably the best known to an American audience. And it was said that the Germans were so impressed with their fighting proficiency, particularly the 5th Marines, and of course the 5th are relevant to the story of K Company, that they gave them the sort of grudging respect of a moniker, which was Devil Dogs, or Teufelhunden, as the translation would have been. Now, I've looked into this, Ray, and I have to say I haven't found any documentary evidence from the German side that they ever used those terms. So I suspect it was probably an invention by an American journalist. That's certainly where we first see the term used. But nevertheless, it was a name that the U.S. Marines at the time, and indeed today, and certainly in the Second World War, were very proud of. They loved the idea that they'd been called devil dogs. They felt it aptly summed up their fighting prowess as kind of stormtroop infantry. And so the name stuck. And because they called themselves devil dogs, I felt it was justifiable to use for the book.
That makes sense. And as a writer, I'm sure you know better than I do. Don't let facts get in the way of a good story. It doesn't matter how they name it's a great name, and as we're about to see, these guys certainly lived up to that. And that, of course, out of all of the things that I enjoyed about your book was it reminded me of when my son went into the Marines. He went in a typical young guy, kind of undisciplined, whatever, and he comes out telling me what to do, that I need to dress better, I need to, and he's got certain terms for everything. So obviously the Marines turned him into one of their own, which he was very proud of. That kind of reminded me of the next question. These guys are going to go into training. They call it recruit training, I believe. And obviously they're going to come out tough fighting Marines. But they went in as civilians. They went in as steel workers from Pennsylvania, farm boys from Kansas, from other places in the South, city boys from various, locations all over the country. All of that is not going to prepare them for the world that they're about to enter, a world of jungles, sand, beaches, not the good kind, and of course mosquitoes and bugs and diseases and humidity and rain. And as tough as that is for them, that's not the main enemy they're about to face. They're about to face disciplined, experienced troops who are, for lack of better word, fanatics.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair to use that term. I mean, when they first arrived in Guadalcanal, they effectively thought, I'm sure we'll come on to the various beats of the story, but I'm sure the Marines effectively thought, well, we've got them on the run because we've surprised them, and indeed they had. Right. The initial landings were a surprise, but the Japanese very quickly turned the tables, and what I think the Marines had to get their heads around is not only the physical conditions, as you've already pointed out, Ray, but a really, really obdurate opponent. Not just obdurate, an opponent who felt sort of spiritually and mentally superior to the Americans. I mean, the West is often accused of racism, but you can clearly see in the mindset of the Japanese and all the brainwashing, frankly, they've gone through in the previous decades, that they very much felt superior to the Westerners. They felt the Westerners were soft. The American guys that they were going to come up against, they could intimidate and they could frighten. And one of the ways that they were hoping to achieve that is to show utter ruthlessness on the battlefield. Now, of course, I think human nature tells us, well, two things tell us an interesting thing here. First of all, the American Marines, in fact, American soldiers in the Second World War, were much tougher than the Japanese realized. These were guys who came from, a lot of them who came from really difficult backgrounds across the United States, as you pointed out, Ray. They'd also been through, the searing experience of the Depression in the 1930s. I mean, these were people who were used to getting by on not a lot of money and food. They had lots of privations in their lives, and so they were able to adapt. And then the other question that comes into this is, can you intimidate people by sheer brutality? Generally speaking, in my experience, this just produces a toughness and a brutality on the other side. And that's exactly what happens. So one of the fascinating things about following these guys is seeing how they adjust to the tremendous challenges they have to face, and how for some of them it really does drag them to a very dark place that it's going to take years for them to come back from.
Yeah, at the end of the day, when all else fails, fight fire with fire. I think these guys learned very quickly. Now, I was kind of surprised, and I don't know if this this comes across, but I was kind of surprised. There was a lot of these devil dogs who were in college, had finished college. I mean, some of them were pretty brainy coves. They had degrees, and they gave it up for country, because of Pearl Harbor. But going back to the ones that you were mentioning, a lot of these guys struggled, and joining the Marines meant that they were going to get 2 or 3 meals a day. They were going to be taken care of. And so it did change their lives. And so you're right. So when they go to the jungle, having hard times, not having enough sleep, not having enough food, that's pretty normal for them because, like you said, that's how they grew up during the Depression. And I don't think the Japanese factored in the deprivations that these men had gone through before they got to Guadalcanal.
Exactly right. I mean, one of my key characters in the story, Thurman Miller, he's one of 16 siblings from Otsego, West Virginia. I mean, the Appalachians. He's been brought up in grinding dirt poor poverty. he knows what privation is. And he makes the point actually himself, and in his wonderful account of the book that he wrote many years later, that actually it was easier for people like him who came from his sort of backgrounds to adjust, the very point you're making. And yet even Thurman Miller was pretty shocked by some of the early experiences in combat against the Japanese, and the sort of depths to which the Japanese were prepared to plunge to intimidate the Americans, as we are discussing.
Right. And I know this is getting ahead of it, but I just want to tell the readers real quick, by the time you finish reading this book, you will feel like you've been in rain or humidity for like 4 months straight. I mean, you made it so visceral in the book. Some of these guys weren't dry for a while. And again, that just gets back to a discipline in dealing with these deprivations. I have to say, one of the reasons that I was excited about your book was because, in all honesty, Guadalcanal is not one of my the areas that I know very well. So early on in the book, when I got to the part where the Japanese were able to slip in some naval units and some vessels, and the Americans have to depart, they have to get their surface ships, they have to get their carrier, they have to get the supplies, they have to get everything out of there because they can't afford to lose these vessels. This is, it's the very, very lifeblood of the war in the Pacific. So I was absolutely horrified when these ships are pulling away, leaving these men to themselves, and they've only offloaded about half of the supplies. So again, this is probably not what they planned for, but the Marines and the Navy obviously figure out they still got a thing or two to learn when it comes to fighting against the Japanese.
For sure. I mean, just to give the story a bit of context, I mean, Guadalcanal is the first major U.S. ground offensive of the Second World War, takes place in August 1942, which is a good few months after Pearl Harbor, of course, right, which was December 1941. And in that period, Ray, there's been an almost unbroken run of Japanese success, both in the Far East, but also against the U.S. in the Philippines, against the British in Malaya. I mean, they have had one victory after another. But for Midway, the big carrier battle that takes place in June 1942, in which the Japanese lose 4 carriers to the Americans 1, there really hasn't been, a serious attempt to stop these successes. So Guadalcanal takes place as an attempt, the first big attempt to roll back these advances. And if you look on a map of the Pacific, you'll see that Guadalcanal is quite close to New Guinea and not a million miles away from Australia. So that's where the Japanese are heading. They were making no bones about it. And certainly the successful, ultimately, in an unbelievably brutal 4-month campaign, but ultimately the successful defense of Guadalcanal and keeping hold of that airstrip, which was so important to a lot of these island battles, really, in effect, saves Australia. And the Australians are fully cognizant of that and applaud the 1st Marine Division, which is the initial Marine formation that goes in there, of which, of course, K Company, 3/5th Marines, is a component part.
Right. So the American forces landed. Like you said, they were able to surprise the Japanese, and the American officers and the command structure, they know they have to start somewhere, and they decide this is it. But things do not go according to plan, which is quite normal in war. And the Devil Dogs and other Marines are going to end up fighting from August to December. I don't think that was planned, but if you want to describe any of the earlier battles, that would be great. But also if you could talk a little bit about the physical transformation from August to December. I mean, these guys were put through hell and back.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the conditions, haven't we? I mean, just so all bad things happen at once. They land on the island with these very unusual tropical conditions, very brutal jungle conditions. They're wet all the time, and they're getting a lot of illness not just because the conditions are so tough. They are never dry, as you pointed out, pretty much the whole time they're on Guadalcanal. They have no change of uniforms. I'll talk a little bit about their physical condition right at the end of the campaign, but just surviving, just staying alive in the jungle was bad enough. And then, of course, they have this incredibly obdurate foe. So you spoke about the naval battle that led to them being marooned. Well, this had 2 effects. One was psychological, the idea that you've lost your backup. Marines always have the backup of the U.S. Navy. They've lost that now. And the second point is they never landed enough supplies or ammunition in the first place. In fact, they didn't even have enough on the original ships. They were very much low down on the sort of quota that would have been needed to survive. So you've got a double whammy going on here. And I would say for the first 6 weeks, the campaign is really on a knife edge as the Japanese are more successfully feeding in reinforcements to the island. And the Americans on the island, that's chiefly the 1st Marine Division, which is about 19,000 strong, give or take. There were some on outlying islands as well, are trying to cling on to really a very small bit of the whole of the island, and that's effectively grouped around the airfield. So what you've got, and it has been depicted quite well in some dramas, notably the Pacific, what you've got really is a situation where it looks like an offensive, but actually they're immediately on the defensive. And the question is, can they hold out? And it's really a knife edge. Some of the defensive battles, which the K Company and, of course, the rest of the division take part in to defend the airfield, are really on a knife edge. I mean, there's one in particular that almost breaks through. In fact, there are some dead Japanese found in divisional HQ, or the divisional command post, Ray, which tells you how deep into the defensive system they got. And it's really, really close run thing. I think people look at Guadalcanal and they look at the, in effect, the industrial might of America in the Second World War and think sooner or later it was a foregone conclusion. And it certainly was not, particularly in 1914, at this early stage when Japan very much had parity, if not still a slight superiority in naval forces. And that is crucial, of course, when you're fighting over such huge distances as they were in the Pacific.
This podcast is brought to you by the state of North Carolina. If you're looking for a leg up for your business, look no further than North Carolina. There are many reasons that CNBC has ranked it the top state for business. The evolution of its tax code is one of them. Among all states with a corporate tax rate, North Carolina has the lowest. Even better, by 2030, it won't even have one. Now that'll make the neighbors jealous. So if you're all in on better business, it's all in North Carolina. Visit allinnc.com to learn more.
Right. I was trying to imagine, because and we'll get into this in a minute, but you get access to a lot of these guys, either stuff they wrote during that time or they wrote afterwards. And so you've got a lot of detail that you can work with. And out of all of the things that I liked about your book, I want the listeners to know that you put the reader in the battle. Suicide Creek alone was giving me nightmares. I just couldn't walk away from it. It was so scary and so horrific. And I'm trying to picture being in a hot, humid jungle where there are times when it's so thick, I can't see more than 10 feet ahead of me. And of course, that's perfect for ambushes. That's perfect for snipers, which the Japanese were very effective in using. But I think there was one gentleman, I'm sorry I didn't write down his name. By the time December comes, he's lost like 45 pounds. And these are already young kids who don't have a lot of body fat in the first place. And so they were, I don't know if the word is anemic or decimated physically, but all the time they still have to fight. They're getting very little sleep, and the Japanese are very good at harassing the Americans. They try to give them as much trouble as they can at night not so they can't get any sleep. But again, the Japanese have got this down to a science, and they are very effective. The technological, the industrial might, the population, the riches of America don't matter all that much on this one little island. It's man to man, it's hand to hand, and there's a lot of up close and personal combat.
Yeah, you're talking about Thurman Miller. You mentioned the Marine at the end of Guadalcanal campaign. That was Thurman Miller. I mean, he goes down from about 160 pounds to 115. I mean, that's effectively losing a third of his body weight. Right. And as you say, Ray, they weren't, they didn't have any extra to begin with. They came from these tough backgrounds, just enough food to get by. So they were looking like scarecrows. I mean, I mentioned, I think, that there were no uniforms sent out to Guadalcanal. They literally came out in what they'd gone in with. Wow. And by that time, they were looking like scarecrows. They were, everything was sort of frayed and cut off at the knees. And their sheer physical and mental state at that point was, I would say, made them incapable of fighting on at that stage. I mean, they weren't asked to, of course. Fortunately, they were taken out of Guadalcanal in December, as you point out. The fighting actually continues on until February the following year. But really, I think you have to stress the point that the the heart has gone out of the Japanese fight by December. In other words, the 1st Marine Division's job is done by then. They've broken the back of Japanese resistance. And that was recognized by the Japanese themselves, who admit, I mean, one of their senior commanders admitted that it was the graveyard of the Japanese army. So they went in thinking they could intimidate and overwhelm these U.S. Marines.
Right.
And they came out, realizing what an unbelievably obdurate and tough opponent they had actually gone up against.
Absolutely. And we'll get into kind of the more, without obviously too much details, gruesome parts of this. But I wanted to ask, because you mentioned Miller, and you, of course, you're using a lot of sources, which made this book absolutely phenomenal. But I have to ask, when my son was a recruit, and he made it quite clear to me not to call him a Marine yet, he was only a recruit, he would tell me about, in his letters, he would tell me about some of the guys that he was with, the other recruits. And I will never forget this. In one letter, he said, I would fight beside these guys because they're crazy, but I would not go out drinking with these guys because, again, they're crazy. So who were some of the people that stood out to you? I know you had some people you had more information on than others, but to your mind, who were some of the more, I'm not even sure what word to use. Is it flamboyant? Is it gung-ho? Is it brave? Who were some of the people that really stood out to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ray. And actually, the tragedy of my answer is that a lot of those guys, those, as you say, the gung-ho ones, the ballsy ones, the upfront ones, actually didn't come through the story. Right. And I'll talk about one in particular in just a second. But, and that's not to say that anyone had a cushy run. Of course, they didn't. We already talked about the conditions which affected everyone. But, of course, the really ballsy ones were, when it got to a desperate combat situation, were the ones prepared to lead from the front, and they didn't need to, be sergeants or officer or platoon commanders. Just as a quick aside, Ray, it's amazing how many platoon commanders die. Yes. Platoon leaders die. It's probably the single most dangerous rank to hold in the U.S. Marines. But in any case, the guy I want to mention is someone called Weldon DeLong, who actually was Canadian by birth, came from Nova Scotia. But he came over to the States, Massachusetts, when he was quite young. Joined the Marine Corps really to effectively keep him out of trouble. Sounds a bit like your son and one or two others in the story, but really took to it, took to that combination of challenge and discipline, which presumably was something lacking in his life. And he became someone everyone looked up to. At the key point of the story in Guadalcanal, he's only a corporal, okay? I say only, I mean, that's a significant NCO rank, but he's not, he's not a sergeant, he's not a platoon sergeant, he's not one of the senior NCOs, he's not a gunny, he is just a corporal. And yet on this, one of the most brutal fights on Guadalcanal, when the Devil Dogs are actually taking the initiative, that is, they are attacking rather than defending, it took place on the 3rd of November on the Matanacao River, or very close to the Matanacao. And they are tasked with overwhelming a very strongly held Japanese position with some field guns there. In fact, they were probably anti-tank guns they had lined up there. And the U.S. Marines who are trying to break into that position are getting mown down, a lot of casualties taken. And eventually, effectively, two people say enough. One of them is an officer in I Company, which is a sister company to K Company. And the other one is Weldon DeLong. Now, you might have thought, well, where are the officers in K Company at this point? And that's a question I asked myself, I have to say. And the company commander, Patterson, during Guadalcanal, I would say does not cover himself with glory during the campaign. I try not to pull any punches about, if someone's admired by their Marines, there tends to be a reason for that. And if they're not admired quite so much, like Patterson wasn't, vice versa. And that seems to be the case. So Weldon DeLong really takes on the job of an officer. In fact, it's the company commander who leads his men into action, and it's Weldon DeLong who leads a sort of disparate group of K Company men, not only in an initial bayonet charge, but then when that bayonet charge is held up briefly, he and a few others go forward to knock out a 37mm anti-tank gun. In fact, they take that gun. And it's only in the final part of the battle, when they're effectively mopping up, that he is killed by a Japanese who's hiding submerged in the water. You could say incredibly bad luck, but of course, he's the one going around making sure that there are no Japanese left alive to kill people. And his death, of course, is testament to the fact that, as Richard Frank mentioned to me when we were discussing this book, and he was kind enough to read the manuscript, the Pacific historian Richard B. Frank, who wrote that wonderful book on Guadalcanal. He said to me, well, was it any wonder they were wary about taking prisoners? And DeLong's death sums that up. But the final point about DeLong is that I think some of your listeners may know that certainly in the Second World War, if you were awarded a Navy Cross, which both the other officer and DeLong were, you would have a ship named after you. Now, sadly, of course, DeLong does not survive that battle. It's a posthumous Navy Cross, but a year or two later, a destroyer was named after DeLong, the USSS DeLong. So that's some nice little, bit of history that his family possibly could take away. But it was people like DeLong who were the gung-ho ones who, sadly, too often in this story, do not live to tell the tale.
Yes, I mean, obviously a war, when you get to the point of war, all rules and niceties and everything else it's completely broken down. There are no rules. It's all about victory and killing the other guys before they kill you, which is, of course, what the Marines, their main purpose is. I lost count of the number of times somebody was shot and it hit their canteen or it hit some part of equipment on them that saved their lives or lessened the damage. And the bayonet charges. Oh my good, I would never have the courage. Picture 100 Marines, fixed bayonets, charge forward. I mean, again, I lost some sleep in a good way, but these guys are tough as heck. There was one gentleman, it was during the Battle of Suicide Creek, where he's trying to run away because they know they've gone too far and they need to back up. He gets hit in the back, gets up and is able to go away, and amazingly he's not hurt. But the bullet had hit something in his backpack or something, and he says to his friends, he said something like, well, I guess the Japanese probably think we're pretty tough. I got shot in the back, got up and walked away. But it was just the freak nature of random violence and bullets flying all over the place. I guess it just comes down to luck at some point.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, you can, the old saying, you can make your own luck. And one of the ways to make a lot of bad luck is if you're the guy, leading people forward into danger. So that was the point I was really making about DeLong. But being a broader point, of course, about all combat is incredible elements of fortune are involved. And I think a lot of combat soldiers, simply to survive, to keep going day after day, quickly become very philosophical about it, Ray. Some of them become very superstitious. It's absolutely true. And they always must have a certain, item on them. And if they don't have it, they think there's going to be bad luck. And some predict their deaths, of course. And we think afterwards, well, did they really know they were going to die? And I don't think it's about that. I think, of course, for every 5 times, it's like the old idea of coincidence. For every 5 times you predict your death, if you're actually going to die on one of them, it sort of proves the point. But it's the times when you don't die and you think, oh, well, it wasn't my day today, that I think gives the lie to any kind of predestination, so to speak. It's just really, really bad luck. And in some cases, incredible good luck. So you see a character like Eugene Sledge, who, I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit about in a moment, who writes probably, in my view, the finest memoir of the Pacific War, and indeed arguably the whole of the Second World War, with the old breed. Eugene is absolutely, as you were saying, an unusual one for an enlisted man in the Marines, because he came from a college background. He was really heading down the track of becoming a Marine officer. And I do think it quite ironic that his family were determined he become an officer because they thought it was slightly unbecoming to go in as an enlisted man. But I reckon they also had in the back of their minds it was more dangerous to be an enlisted man. And as we've already discussed, Ray, it was actually the opposite was true. And if he'd gone in as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Marines, he may not have come back.
Exactly. And that reminds me, there was one, and you're right, you do have to be philosophical. You have to distance yourself. You have to come up with some mental device so you can go on day after day in this thing where you could die any second. There was one Marine who kept joking about, I think he got shot in the shoulder, and he kept joking about, well, I was going to make my father $20,000 more richer by, I guess, the policy that he would get, but he'll have to wait on that money because I was only wounded. I mean, these guys are cutting up jokes. One guy is like, I wish John Wayne would come in here and let him have it with both barrels. John Wayne wasn't coming. They had to do it themselves. So again, that humor, that whatever mental gymnastics you need to play, these guys did. But they had no other choice. They had to do that in order to adapt and keep fighting. Speaking of that, one of the steps of success, or I guess in this case victory, is you have to learn and adapt, because you go into the book about the training, the Navy's training, the Marines are training, everybody's training, but that's theoretical. When the boots are on the ground, that's when it's all very real. So the Marines fight for 4 months, and they're probably thinking their bit is done because they've just been through hell and back. We know their bit is not done, but for a while they get to take a break, and we'll go into that. But from the fighting from August to December, the higher-ups, the officers, the command structure, someone's got to take a look at what happened. Clearly, it could have been a lot smoother or better organized or whatever. And they have to make some changes because, yes, they're winning. Like you said, by December, the back of the enemy is broken. But the whole process was pretty ugly, and it was, like you said, on a knife's edge for a long time. What were some of the changes that the higher-ups decided were needed, whether it's equipment, number of men, techniques, what have you, but clearly they need to fight better?
Exactly right. I just to make a very quick general point about the American military, Ray, they are very good at learning. There's always this sort of great debate in militaries. Can you learn from experience? Can you learn from mistakes?
Right.
The American military are very good at that, mainly because they try and do that learning as quickly as possible, and that's really the key. If you wait for the end of a war, it's far too late. So you need to do it. You need to be learning as you're going along, but to be specific about Guadalcanal and the Marines. The Marines were designed as amphibious troops. The original amphibious doctrine, which is really thrashed out in the 1930s, is an American doctrine. The Japanese were the only other army in the world that had anything like a comparable amphibious capability, and they weren't bad at what they did. But the basic premise of amphibious doctrine in the 1930s, which of course was used at Guadalcanal, is you've got to make a lodgment on the shore. So the plan is to get ashore, get your hands on whatever vital infrastructure there is there. In this case, an airfield, and sooner or later, the heavier armed troops, because in effect, Marines are light infantry without the same sort of firepower that an army division would have. Sooner or later, these other guys are going to come in and take over. That's the plan. The Marines are never supposed to fight for months on end. And we've already talked about the unique conditions on Guadalcanal, where they were effectively stranded there for a big chunk of time. So what they realize is this is going to be about resupply. So it's going to be about logistics. It's going to be about air support. So it's going to be about making sure that you have either aircraft carriers close by, which, of course, by the time we get to Okinawa, by the end of the story, they've got 20 fleet carriers. So that's all the air power, almost all the air power you need on the sea alone. And of course, as you take territory on land on Okinawa, and again, the airfields were crucial there, you can set up your own air bases ashore. But more specifically, as far as the Marines are concerned, and certainly as far as K Company is concerned, it was beefing up the firepower of the unit. So A Company, of course, is part of a battalion, which is part of a regiment. So if you beef up a company, this is going to be exponential across the board. And a regiment, just so that anyone from the UK who's listening to this gets a kind of sense, is really the comparable unit as far as our army is concerned, is a brigade. So we're talking about a sizable formation of thousands of men. And what they did with K Company is it went from a size of about 180 to 190, beefing it slowly but surely up to about 230, 240, but not just extra manpower, but also extra firepower. So they added machine guns, they added mortars, and they improved the weapons. And of course, ultimately, the big game changer in the whole of the Second World War, and particularly for the Marines, because they didn't have them on Guadalcanal, was the issue of the Garand M1 semi-automatic, the first semi-automatic rifle in common issue with an army anywhere in the world, but an unbelievably effective bit of kit that was sturdy, accurate, easy to fire, and had a very high rate of fire. And that M1 alone was going to play a really significant role in the next few years, not just for the Marines, but for all the U.S. Armed Forces.
Welcome to the window of opportunity. When your next move can either make your business famous or obsolete. So you need to be ready. Be good surprises and bad surprises ready. Be opening a Portland, Houston, and Providence location on the same day ready. Be stock options plus paid family leave ready. SAP has been there and can help you be ready for anything that happens next. Because it will. Be ready with SAP. Visit sap.com/be ready.
Right, yeah, the Devil Dogs have to go in there first, and then their commanders can go, okay, I can see we can do this better, but they had to go in first and obviously pay the price for it. Oh, and I just want to let the readers know that you go into minute detail when it comes to the firing the mortars, the difference between the rifles, the guns, and I really did appreciate that. I'm not in the military. I've never been in the military. I watch videos, but obviously that's not the same thing as handling this, so your detailed descriptions really fleshed it out for me, and I wanted to thank you. The next question, I had something planned where I would say something like, oh, this war is going to get really personal. It's already personal because of Pearl Harbor, and it's going to get even more intense when they're fighting the Japanese. But instead of a general question like that, if I could get you to describe I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the Geta Patrol, I'm not sure the proper way to say it. I believe that just kind of giving us an overview of that will really explain so much better what these men were dealing with, how they had to adapt, and the feelings of just, like you were saying earlier, at the end of the day, you just have to strip down to the bare basics and kill them before they kill you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty bad on pronunciation too, Ray. I get picked up on this all the time. I mean, the patrol was named after the divisional chief of intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Gurtka, who was a bit of a fire-breathing officer, even though he was in charge of intelligence. And when they got to Guadalcanal, and this was only a few days after they arrived, actually. So we're literally 4 or 5 days after the initial landings, which were on the 7th. We're now on the 12th. Right. And on that day, Gurtka decides to lead a patrol with not a lot of firepower. He's got intelligence that there are certain Japanese prepared to surrender, and so he goes out in some landing craft, lands outside the perimeter of the 1st Marine Division, so in the boonies, in enemy territory, and he's hoping to negotiate the surrender of some Japanese. Well, it's a ruse. He's been lured into a trap, and everyone is killed. Now, so far, so ordinary, frankly, because the Japanese took very few prisoners, if at all. In fact, apart from a couple of guys who were already on the island who were taken prisoner by the Japanese, none of the Marines were. So if you fell into the hands of the Japanese, you were going to be killed. But it's the way they were killed that the Devil Dogs who came upon the scene a few hours later found so horrendous. Now, not content with just killing them, they literally cut them into pieces, and worse than that, left the body parts strewn along the beach. And this is very much going back to my earlier point about the shock and intimidation effect that the Japanese were hoping to have. They were trying to scare the Marines. They're thinking, if we're capable of doing this, we're capable of doing anything. It had the opposite effect, as we've discussed. Just to give you a quick quote from one of my other key men, Jim McHenry, who comes from South Brooklyn in New York. And he says that as he comes upon the scene of the Gurtka Patrol, the first thing I saw was the severed head of a Marine. The head was moving back and forth in the water and looked like it was alive. Then I realized it was just bobbing in the small waves, lapping at the shore. And this immediately hardened all the guys there. You know, as Thurman Miller, who was also on the patrol, saw this, said, we suddenly realized, all the degrees of degradation to which the human race could descend we were looking at. We were hardened by our training and our reflexes were sudden, our minds alert. But now, and this is the interesting bit of the quote, our killing potential was amplified. A second ingredient, hatred, had been added. What kind of warfare was this? And from that point on, and this is just 5 days into their war, they were hardened and toughened and prepared to, effectively go a long way down the track to meeting fire with fire.
Absolutely, the Japanese plan monumentally backfired, and there's a saying, and of course I'm not comparing Marines to mice or whatever, but even a trapped mouse will fight back because, you've got no choice. And so the Marines are like, okay, this is what you're doing. All right, this is what we're going to do. And eventually the Marines, they're going to have greater firepower once they are able to bring supplies in and they're able to deliver as well as they got. So, that was a very valuable lesson they had to learn. And if the Japanese thought they were going to just be able to scare them into going away or giving up or whatever, backfired monumentally. And just to give the audience an idea, and this book is like 500, or I'm trying to remember how many. So we're covering very little, but I wanted to save it for the readers. But by the time February 1943 comes along, the Japanese have lost somewhere just over 25,000 men of various services, and the Americans lost just under 5,000 men. Again, all branches. But this is only the first step, like you were saying. This is the Americans finally putting boots on the ground somewhere in the Pacific, and they've got these kind of casualties. This is going to be long, and this is going to be ugly.
Exactly right. And the story, of course, of the Pacific is wide and varied. It moves all over the place. It includes the Army under MacArthur and the Navy under Nimitz. I mean, you effectively got two axes, or very basically, or putting it into as simple terms as possible, two axes of advance heading towards the home islands of Japan. One, as I say, through the Central Pacific and one coming up through the Philippines, but all with the same aim of finally hopping from one location to another, knocking out whatever defenders there are there as far as the Japanese are concerned, occasionally bypassing some places. I mean, the great fortress of Rabaul, which was on New Britain, well, there is a landing on New Britain by K Company and the rest of the 1st Marine Division, but that's on the far side of the island. Right. Admittedly, Ray, it was an island 370 miles long, so, they were a fair way away from Rabaul, but Rabaul was left to its own devices, and there were 70 or 80,000 Japanese there. And so every now and again, when they felt that they could neutralize and isolate a strong point, they left it. If they were absolutely convinced they needed to take it because there were other factors, Iwo Jima being a very good example of that. I mean, the reason they take Iwo Jima, again, it's another hopping of the islands, getting closer to the home islands. But Iwo Jima was particularly important because there were various air bases on it that the Japanese were using to interdict the attempt to bomb Japan. And so by taking those airfields, not only could they stop the Japanese flying from them, they could fly from them themselves, and they could use Iwo Jima as an island from which to rescue downed aircrew. And a lot of lives are saved. So, of course, you've got the butcher's bill of how many people die in Iwo Jima. I mean, it's a horrendous campaign, which is not covered in my book, actually, because the 1st Marine Division don't fight there. Right. But something almost as bad is covered, and that's Peleliu. And Peleliu is a campaign that takes place just before Iwo Jima and is also incredibly controversial because the soldiers who fight there, that is the 1st Marine Division. So just to be clear about the beats of the story, they start off in Guadalcanal, go back to Australia, then they fight in New Britain, then they go back to it's supposed to be rest and recuperation on an island called Papavu, which is a bit of a brutal place to be sent because it has no infrastructure. Right. Then they fight on Peleliu, back to Papavu, by which time it's got properly sorted out, and it is it does have infrastructure by then. And then finally fight in Okinawa. So you've got these 4 campaigns that the Devil Dogs fight. Not a single Devil Dog goes through all 4, Ray, for the very good reason that you were rotated back before you'd fought in 4 campaigns. Some fight in 3, and they were very unlucky if they were fighting in their 3rd of 3 campaigns and they died. And, of course, that happens to a number of people. When I say unlucky is because the traditional or the sort of general rule was you went home after 2 campaigns or 2 years abroad. But every now and again, particularly when they needed manpower, they asked people if they were happy to, waive their rights to go back, and a lot of them said they would. And of course, can you imagine if you're the family of someone who's done that and they don't come back from the 3rd campaign, which is what tragically happens. Right. But just to knit the story together, you've got people coming into the story all the way through. Some are going to natural wastage, they're getting wounded, they're getting killed, but others are being rotated home, including Thurman Miller, who, interestingly enough for me, because I was very keen to see his reaction. He fights in the first 2 campaigns, then he's given the option to go home because he's been out a lot longer than most other people. He takes it, But I don't think he ever really, in fact, he states this in his memoirs, I don't think he ever really forgives himself for that decision. You and I wouldn't blame him, and I don't think anyone reading this book would blame him, but he still feels that he's abandoned his guys. And of course, by that point, he's a gunnery sergeant, so he's very senior in the company, and he feels a tremendous sense of responsibility, particularly to the younger guys coming through, the rookies, who he knows, without a firm hand to guide them, without experience to guide them, are going to be even more vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I'll get back to Rabaul in just a second, but that's one of the things that's always fascinated me about combat, because I could die any second. You're the guy next to me. You could die any second. Do I get to know you? Do I open up? Do I form a bond with you, knowing that one of us could die, and that's just going to make what I'm going through that much harder? But you're stuck with these people, and you, whether you like it or not, you do become family. You talk for hours. You get to know each other probably better than your parents know you. I mean, these guys bonded, and just like you said, the change in personnel, the casualties, the dying. And of course, yeah, so when you're asked, will you stick around? It's very hard to say no to family. And this has now become their family. But just the carnage that just kept going, the new people coming in, the people getting shot, people getting wounded. Again, it just added to the visceral experience of reading this book. So I did just want to touch on this, a little lighthearted moment, if we could, in the middle of all this. So they do their 4 months. It's time for some R&R. Not that goes quite smoothly at first either. They're sent to Brisbane, and they've got like 4 months of back pay. They got a ton of money. They're ready to have some fun and cut loose. A lot of the Australian males are gone because they're fighting in North Africa or other places. And so when the Marines get there, doesn't exactly go smoothly at first.
No, well, they go to Brisbane initially, as you say, and Brisbane, of course, is in the tropics in Australia, and therefore the conditions, particularly as far as the mosquitoes are concerned, a lot of the guys have come out of Guadalcanal with malaria and various other illnesses, as we've discussed, and they get to Brisbane, and it looks like more of the same. It's not the shiny Brisbane that you will see today, Ray. It was a pretty basic one-horse town in the Second World War, and they were pretty unimpressed with both the conditions and also what was on offer. So it was very fortunate, and I don't think this is a coincidence. I discussed this in the book, that I think the senior commanders realized, listen, the guys aren't happy. They're not in any fit state to defend Australia at this point. So let's actually get them as far away from the front line as possible. Let's take them down to Melbourne. Melbourne was a different kettle of fish because it's temperate. It's in the south of Australia, Victoria province. And down there, conditions are much happier. It's a much more sophisticated town. It was probably the most sophisticated town in Australia at that point. I mean, people often think of it as the capital. It never was, but it's the commercial center. And it was a town that not only was very pleased to see the Marines, because as I say before, they were perceived to have saved Australia. In fact, when the ships first arrived with the Marines in Melbourne, there is very much a kind of, ticker tape parade, not quite the same as you might expect back in the US, but not far off it. And they are welcomed literally with open arms into people's homes. And they have a great time down there. Yes, there are some issues with taking a lot of, or going out with a lot of the young Australian girls who, of course, have been deprived of a bit of company because, as you pointed out, Ray, a lot of their young men are overseas fighting in the 9th Australian Division, in particular in the desert. Now, what happens, interesting enough, halfway through this period when they're in Australia is that some of the Australians come back and there is a bit of bad feeling, and they manage to deal with it by holding this kind of massive, effectively piss up, with beer in one of the football stadiums, in which, frankly, they're probably expecting carnage, but they all get on incredibly well. They have all kinds of competitions, sports, lots of jokey bits of entertainment, and they get on like a house on fire. So they diffuse a lot of that problem. And just to make the final point, that some of the Marines meet Australian women who they're not just happy to see for the evening and go out with, actually become their longtime life partners. And one of my other main characters in the book, R.V. Bergin, meets his future wife there, and finally she moves from Australia to the US at the end of the book, and and that's a lifelong association that began during this period of trying to put the 1st Marine Division back together again after the horrors of Guadalcanal. And it's some people say to me, well, they had quite a long time in Australia and then a bit of retraining after that before they go back into action at the end of 1943. But when you realize what they've gone through, they absolutely needed that time to bed the new guys in and to really get themselves into the proper physical and mental shape so they could be put into the meat grinder again. And I say that advisedly because, as you pointed out, Ray, pretty much every campaign that they take part in, what starts out as K Company with around 250 men generally ends up as 70 or 80 by the end of it.
Yeah, the turnover is just gut wrenching. One thing about the Melbourne. Alcohol can cause trouble, but it can also bring guys together, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
And what I admired about I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. One of the guys certainly fell for an Australian lass, and he wanted to marry her, but he's like, you know what? There's a good chance I'm going to die, and I don't want to leave her a widow. That's a horrible thing to do. So. He told her that he liked her very much and he wanted to think about a future, but for right now, he couldn't make any plans because he wasn't sure if he was going to have a future. So very honorable on his part. But yeah, there were a lot of relations that built up. And I'm trying to remember. I think that in the book, a lot of Australian families welcomed these American Marines into their homes. They fed them, they talked to them, and they got to share stories about their life back in America. And so, yeah, they were seen as heroes to a lot of people. And when you invite someone into your home, I mean, it doesn't get more intimate than that.
No, and actually, the guy you were referring to, I think, was Jim McEnery, all of them for a while are enjoying the beer and the nights out and the meeting of some of the Australian girls. But McEnery, I think, very much makes a decision quite early on that he's, it's not for him. Nobody knows whether any of them are going to come back. And interesting enough, his best buddy is a guy called Lou Gargano. He's incredibly handsome. There's a picture of him in the book. I mean, he's an absolute heartthrob.
Right.
I mean, and apparently, according to McEnery, most of the Australian girls that meet him are kind of throwing themselves at him because he's just, he looks like a film star. Yeah. But Gargano is completely uninterested. He's got a wife and a young baby at home, and that's all he's thinking about. And McEnery, not only does he not want to, he doesn't know what the future holds, but he also doesn't want to leave his guy out. They can't double date anymore because Gargano says, I'm not interested. Yeah. So he pretty much sticks with Gargano. But, without giving too much of the book away, it's not necessarily a happy ending where his future is concerned. And, I think one of the sadnesses of the book, I wrote it sort of allowing the story to unfold and not giving away too much as you're working your way through it. And it is unfortunate, and I felt the same researching and writing it that I imagine some of the readers are going to feel, which is that you get very attached to some of the characters, and not all of them are going to come through. And that, I'm afraid, is the reality of war. It's, they often say, well, the best are going to die. We've spoken about DeLong. Gargano was another one. He's a platoon sergeant, very much led from the front. And not all of these guys are going to come through. And you find yourself, almost a bit like the soldiers that you were referring to. I don't want to get too close to these characters. Exactly. So I know that's an odd thing when you're talking about a reader, but sometimes you just have to do that because you're anticipating, oh, crikey, is he going to get through the next campaign?
Absolutely. It's like if you're watching a film, oh, he's the good guy, she's the good person in the film. They're not going to die. They're going to go through hell and back, but they're not going to die. That's not reality. That's certainly not war. Yeah, I got attached to all these guys because they were joking, and I loved the nicknames. I grew up in a military family. My father was in the Air Force, and you learned very quickly not to do anything too stupid because someone was going to remember that and pick a nickname for you, and that was your name for the foreseeable future. So I enjoyed those as well. So again, this is this book has a lot going on it. We're going to obviously skip most of it, but unlike some World War II books, you touch on these guys after the war, and clearly they have been affected by what they did, what they saw, what they had to do to survive, what happened to their friends, and that stayed with them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it's very telling, actually, that immediately after the war, and I don't think this is that uncommon about combat soldiers, but it was particularly true of the Devil Dogs, that they very quickly lost links with their former mates. Now, if you think what they've been through, and if you think how close they were, and we were talking about family, and some of them talk in terms of loving their fellow soldiers, and certainly the acts that they were prepared to do to keep them alive, which is lay down their own lives for their fellow devil dogs. You might be slightly surprised when you read some of that and you think to yourself, well, surely they're going to keep in contact. Surely this is the only way to get through it. But actually, they wanted to forget, and that determination to forget was more powerful than and maybe they never understood, frankly, the good that could come from discussing and, kind of trying to work your way through some of the horrors they've been through. But what you also see gradually as the years go by is more and more of them coming back to the veteran formations. There was a First Marine Division Association that a lot of them are eventually drawn back to. And I think the real catalyst, or one of the big catalysts in all of this, was Eugene Sledge writing his memoir, With the Old Breed. Now, to your point about people affected, I mean, he wrote in letters immediately after the war, which I quote in the book, but also he mentions in the book itself, how badly affected he had been himself. How, he suffered all kinds of sort of effectively PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of what he'd been through. And he did not feel that he fitted into civilian life that easily. And I think a lot of them felt the same. And one of his ways of working his way through it, because he becomes a very respected biologist, works in a university in Alabama, which was his home state, was to write the book. Never intended it to be published. It was based on a lot of jottings he'd made at the time, and he eventually pieced the whole thing together. And it's a wonderfully sort of unflinching, honest account. But when his fellow devil dogs read With the Old Breed, and you've got a lot of responses from them having read it, again in the letters that Eugene Sledge kept, you get a sense of how important that not only is the story told, but to be told in the way that he did it, which is brutally honest, beautifully sort of sensitive account of what they'd all gone through. And he doesn't flinch from the horrors. He doesn't try and muddy the waters and make them seem like they were better guys at times than they really were. He just tries to explain it. And, as you said, Ray, the intention of the book, I mean, I hope that it's worked like this, because the intention of the book is to put you in the place of the soldiers as they experience what they went through, and also try to understand some of the, we haven't gone into it in any great detail, but some of the grimmer acts that are perpetrated by the Marines themselves. We talked about how brutalized they became, some more than others. And Eugene Sledge is always there on the sidelines watching some of this stuff and saying, listen, I know, that was unacceptable, and he lost his humanity. But you need to see the context, and you also need to have that hope that he can come back from that very dark place he was taken to. And I think is exactly what happens after the war, slowly but surely, as they work their way through, as they begin to re-meet as a group of devil dogs. Then it does extraordinarily amount of good for them. Does it expunge, everything they'd have been through? Well, almost certainly not. But is it a massive help to them and their families? I think it certainly is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess writing the book was his form of therapy. And yeah, you need to get together and you need to talk about it. And again, you do put me right there, right beside the fighting, in the fighting. And I've always been a big proponent of, you've got to consider the context, because every decision, every act, everything is made within a certain context. You can't remove that and, judge people. Speaking of Sledge, because you put us in the fighting and you're so brutally honest with it, because you're using their accounts. This book is nothing but a series of highs and lows, mostly lows, and you get attached to these people, and some die and some go home or whatever. But it's almost like, and I'm sure, I don't know how this sounds, but it's almost a perfect setup. So I've gone through this emotional roller coaster reading your book, and at the end you quote Eugene Sledge, and if I could I'm going to try to read it. This is after they found out that Japan surrendered. And, obviously very excited, very happy, because they were looking at, anywhere close to like 1 million deaths to try to conquer the home islands. He writes, "We remembered our dead, so many dead, so many maimed, so many bright futures consigned to the ashes of the past, so many dreams lost in the madness that had engulfed us. Except for a few wildly scattered shouts of joy, the survivors of the abyss sat hollow-eyed and silent, trying to comprehend a world without war." And that was just so brilliant. I mean, all they've known is war for these years. They can't even imagine civilian life, not sweating all the time, not being soaked in their clothes, not having, rations and all this stuff. And suddenly the idea that they get to go back, they literally have to take a moment and adjust their heads to, oh, I did have a life before I went to Guadalcanal.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for selecting that quote, Ray, because that just perfectly sums up the different place that they'd been taken to, or that they were in by the end of the Second World War, and how unbelievably difficult it is going to be for them to return to, what we would describe as normal civilian life. And one other thing to add, or observation to add about that quote, which, I was as impressed by when I first read it as you clearly are, was that no celebration. We haven't huge loss of life, of course, as we know, in the dropping of those 2 atomic bombs. And we're at a time now where there's a saber rattling for the use of nuclear weapons again, which, of course, all of us hope will never be the case. But in the context of the time, I believe, and certainly the men of Devil Dogs believe, that it was justified, because the potential loss of life would have been far greater. But the point I'm trying to make here is no jubilation and no euphoric reaction from Sledge and his fellow Devil Dogs to the news that Japan had surrendered. Just a quiet sort of, acknowledgement that things had changed. Yes, of course, for the better, but how could they really readjust? This sudden realization to readjust is going to be very hard, and it's going to take some of them decades.
Absolutely. It wasn't happiness, it was relief. And I don't have to fight anymore. I don't have to. So how could you not feel? How can relief not be the first thing that you feel? Again, this book is something like 535 pages, so you go into great detail. I thank you very much for that. I think a book like this is needed at least once every generation, because we should never forget that war is all hell, like George Tecumseh Sherman said during the Civil War. So again, thank you very much for coming on the show, and of course, thank you very much for this book. And I guess you've kind of touched on this, but did you want to add anything as far as what you were trying to accomplish in telling the incredible story of the Devil Dogs?
Well, I mean, you've said it all in your summing up there, actually, Ray. I wanted people to understand the visceral nature of war, what it can do to, good people who go in with the right reasons and can find themselves through circumstance and the experience of combat doing some pretty bad things, as well as some extraordinarily heroic things. So I think the get out clause when you're reading a book of this nature is that there, as you say, there are some ups. It's not all down. But if we are going to understand, and when I say we, I'm talking about the public, but also politicians and people who make decisions of this type, they need to understand what war is and what war can do to people, both, of course, the opponents, but also the, your own side too. And, final thought, the question the Devil Dogs asked themselves at the end of this campaign, understandably, is, was it all worth it? And there's another very good quote from Eugene Sledge in which he says, well, you can look at it either way, but in the end, someone's got to stand up and fight for their country, for the freedom of their country. And we were prepared to do that. And let's hope, people will be prepared to do that in the future. Well, we're not quite at such a brutal stage ourselves in the West, but if we just think of what's going on in, on the fringes of Europe, in Ukraine at the moment, you suddenly realize there a whole nation has had to make that decision. And so it's not about shying away from war, but it's understanding that occasionally to defend yourself is important, it is justified, and that's exactly what seems to be happening today.
Absolutely. Mr. David, thank you very much for your time. The book is Devil Dogs, King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, from Guadalcanal to the shores of Japan. Mr. David, thank you again.
Thanks, Ray.